Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about how to subvert tropes. So we recently did a video where I talked about 5 of my least favorite tropes that I'm not a huge fan of, and pretty much everyone has tropes that they don't really like. One thing a lot of writers love doing and that a lot of readers love reading is subverting tropes. Because a trope is something so familiar to the reader, when it's subverted it can be so exciting to read. So today I wanted to share 4 techniques that you can use to subvert tropes and make them new again. A trope is a familiar element that recurs in literature, or at least this case in literature. Tropes can appear in other things as well, and as a result it becomes familiar to the reader. Now in some cases tropes can be useful and actually can be used to your story's benefit. Archetypal characters are character tropes that readers can understand almost immediately. For example, say the mad scientist. If this character appears on the page, the reader basically understands them. Because this character is a trope, the reader can basically understand them and their role in the story as soon as they appear on page. Tropes can also be used to create a framework for your story that readers can understand. If you pick up a book and you're reading the back jacket and there are some tropes or recurring elements that you are familiar with and know you like, that could entice a reader to pick up the book. But one thing readers especially love is when a trope is subverted, because it presents something they know and expect and turns it into something completely new and original and unexpected. Subverting a trope means making it more than it appears. Flipping the trope around so something expected and familiar becomes something new and exciting. The first step to subverting a trope is to understand the trope really well. A lot of time readers write tropes and don't even realize that they're writing a trope, and for that reason it can be very hard to subvert something if you don't even know that there's something to be subverted. If you're writing a novel, do some research to see what tropes you might be including without even realizing, and then really study that trope to see what's familiar and what you might want to change about it. Learn all the qualities of the trope and study stories where you think it worked well and other stories where maybe it didn't work out so well. This can give you ideas on how you might want to flip it around on its head. Number 2, know the difference between tropes and cliches. Cliches are tropes that have become so familiar that they really fall flat. Tropes are familiar, and sometimes that's bad and they really need to be subverted. Other times it can work to your advantage, or not really be an issue. However, with cliches, they're the kind of thing you usually want to avoid. Cliches are much harder to use well because they're so exhausted. You might be able to carry a trope that the reader knows all the way through the book and then subvert it at the end for great payoff. However, the reader might be much less likely to be on board with a cliche that they have to read about for a long period of time, because cliches often feel very flat and tired and aren't very interesting to the reader. You want to use a cliche and subvert it, try to do that earlier on in the piece, whereas with a trope you might be able to carry it a little longer for bigger payoff. Number 3, turn it around, then adjust it. Oftentimes when you use the inverse of a trope, the inverse is almost as much a trope as the trope itself. That's because the straight up opposite of something is fairly expected, almost as expected as the thing itself. So when you flip a trope around, then dial back and adjust it a little, so it's more in kind of that gray area where the reader wouldn't be able to predict it so well. Basically, instead of going 180 degrees from the trope, you can go 180 degrees to get an idea on how to subvert it, but then dial it back to maybe 130 degrees. And number 4, use specific and interesting details to add more depth. Specificity can be the key to giving depth to familiar character type, or even more than a character type, to a plot element or a world element. Anything that is a trope can really be made new and given complexity through specificity. A character might seem familiar and they might completely fall into a trope, but give them really interesting specific details that the reader wouldn't expect, and that makes them so much richer. It's not necessarily subversion, but it's taking something familiar without much depth and giving it a lot of depth. For example, maybe you have the wise mentor character. This is a fairly common trope we've seen a lot of times. Maybe there's something kind of interesting about this guy. Maybe he has a passion for tabletop fantasy role-playing games and he works cash at a hardware store. So those are 4 ways that you can make tropes new again and subvert them. Let me know what your favorite trope is in the comments, or a time that you saw a trope subverted really well. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe for new writing, editing, and publishing videos every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.